The first time I saw Unicho's silk robe hanging in my closet, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I hung my own robe 2 inches to the left of hers, smoothed the wrinkle out of the shoulder, and went downstairs to make coffee like it was any other Tuesday morning in the house I owned. That's the part nobody tells you about Betrayal when it comes wrapped in a $5,000 suit and a voice that used to whisper your name like a prayer. It doesn't announce itself. It moves in quietly, hangs its things in your closet, and waits to see if you'll say something. I didn't say anything. Not yet. My name is Selah Winthrop, and for 3 years I was married to a man named Ji-hoon Baek, a name that made grown men in tailored suits go quiet when it was spoken in the right rooms of Savannah, Georgia, and in the wrong ones too. To the city, he was a shipping magnate, a philanthropist, the kind of man whose family foundation funded hospital wings and got its name engraved in marble. To the 6 other men who orbited him like moons, he was something else entirely. Something with a different set of ledgers, a different kind of debt collection, a different definition of consequences. To me, in the beginning, he was just Ji-hoon, a man who showed up at my father's funeral in the rain without an umbrella, stood at the back so he wouldn't intrude, and later sent no flowers a euro because he told me months afterward, flowers die, and he didn't want to give me one more thing to watch wilt. I married him 11 months after that funeral. I want to be honest about that timeline because it matters later. 11 months. Not because I was naive, and not because I didn't know exactly who and what he was by the time I said yes. I knew. I'd done my homework the way my father raised me to do homework, a euro thoroughly, quietly, and without ever letting the other side see you counting. What Ji-hoon Baek never knew a euro, what none of them knew. Not his mother, not his lieutenants, not the mistress he thought he was hiding so cleverly in the east wing of our house a euro, was that my father hadn't just been a retired judge with a modest pension and a rain-soaked funeral. My father had spent the last 15 years of his life quietly buying up the paper on half of Savannah's old money, including 3 years before I ever met Ji-hoon Baek, the promissory notes underneath the Baek family's shipping empire. I didn't marry into money. I married into a debt I already owned. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the morning of the robe, because that's where this really starts a euro the morning. I stopped playing a wife and started playing the only game I'd ever actually been good at. 3 years earlier, when Ji-hoon slid a ring onto my finger in his mother's garden, Madame Ji-hoon Baek had looked at me the way you look at a stain you're deciding whether to bleach out or simply live with. She never said a cruel word to my face, a euro that wasn't her style. Her cruelty came dressed as concern. "Selah, dear, you understand this family carries certain weights," she told me at the engagement dinner, sliding her eyes over my dark skin, my American last name, the absence of a single ancestor she could look up in a registry that mattered to her. "I do hope you're prepared to carry your share." I smiled at her the way my father taught me to smile at men in courtrooms who thought they'd already won. "I've been carrying weight since before I could walk, Madame Baek. I think I'll manage." She didn't like that answer. She liked it even less 3 years later, when I was still standing in her son's kitchen every morning, coffee in hand, wedding ring on, while her precious empire quietly bled money into accounts I controlled and didn't yet need to mention. Ji-hoon changed the year his father died. Grief does strange things to men who've spent their whole lives being told they're invincible. His father's death didn't make him soft, a euro. It made him hungry, restless, desperate to prove to the 6 lieutenants circling his throne that he was harder, colder, more untouchable than the old man had ever been. He started keeping later hours. Started smelling like someone else's perfume when he thought I was asleep. Started looking at me like I was a line item in his father's will, instead of the woman who'd sat with him in hospital waiting rooms holding his hand through 3 surgeries that almost took his father from him a year early. And then, 4 months ago, Unicho arrived. She came in as a consultant for the shipping division, a title so thin you could see through it from across the harbour. 26 years old, magazine cover beautiful, with the specific kind of laugh that's been practiced in front of a mirror until it sounds spontaneous. I watched her operate at the first dinner she attended in our home a euro, watched her touch Ji-hoon's forearm exactly the socially acceptable amount of time too long, watched her defer to Madame Baek with just enough flattery to make the old woman glow, watched her glance at me exactly once, quick and assessing, the way you check whether a door is locked before you try the handle. I smiled at her too. I'm good at smiling. It's a skill you develop when you spend your whole life being underestimated by people who mistake a soft voice for a soft spine. 3 weeks later, her belongings appeared in the East Wing guest suite. 6 weeks after that, her silk robe was hanging in my closet, because apparently even Ji-hoon Baek's mistress had run out of space in the room he'd given her, and nobody had bothered to ask my permission before treating my home like a hotel with a revolving door. That was the morning I stopped being patient and started being precise. There's a difference, and it's the difference that built the second half of my life. I called my best friend, Tamsin Reyes, that afternoon, because even a woman who's learned to hold her face perfectly, still in front of her husband's family, still needs one person she doesn't have to perform for. Tamsin and I had known each other since our first year of college, back when I was a scholarship kid trying to figure out which fork to use at a formal dinner, and she was the daughter of a Charleston contractor who'd made her own way into rooms nobody expected her in. She understood, better than almost anyone alive, what it cost a black woman to sit at certain tables and still be treated like she'd wandered in through the kitchen. "She hung her robe in your closet," Tamsin repeated, when I told her, and I could hear her set her wine glass down hard enough that it clinked against something on the other end of the line. "In your closet, Selah. Not a guest room. Your closet. I know. And what did you do?" I hung mine 2 inches to the left of it and went downstairs. There was a long pause, the kind Tamsin used when she was deciding whether to be gentle with me or honest with me, because she'd never been able to manage both at the same time. "Baby, I love you, but that man has been treating you like part of the furniture in that house for months now, and you're talking to me about closet space like we're discussing feng shui. I'm not doing nothing, Tamsin. Then what are you doing?" I looked out the window of my study at the live oaks lining Whitfield Square, heavy with Spanish moss, the same trees my father used to walk me past when I was young enough to still believe the world worked the way storybooks said it did. "I'm doing what my daddy taught me to do with people who think you're not paying attention. I'm counting." Tamsin didn't fully understand what I meant that afternoon Euro. Nobody did yet. Not even me completely Euro, but she trusted me enough not to push further, and she said the thing she always said when she could tell I'd already made up my mind about something before I called her. "All right, but you call me the second it stops being counting and starts being something else. I've got a car and I've got a shovel, metaphorically speaking, and I will use both if that family pushes you 1 inch further than you're willing to bend." I laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks, and it was real, which surprised me. "Noted," I said. "I'll call you." If you were standing in that closet, staring at another woman's robe hanging next to your wedding dress, comment the city you'd run to first Euro because Selah didn't run anywhere. She stayed. And staying was about to become the most dangerous thing Ji-hoon Baek ever let happen in his own house. I want to tell you about my father, because you can't understand what happened to Ji-hoon Baek's empire without understanding the man who built the trap it eventually walked into. Judge Selah Winthrop was not a rich man by the standards of the families he sat in judgment over for 30 years on the Chatham County bench, but he was a patient one, and patience, invested correctly, compounds faster than money ever does. He watched, for 3 decades, which families in Savannah built their fortunes on foundations nobody had checked in 2 generations. He watched which shipping empires ran their books through private lending arrangements instead of banks, because banks asked questions men like the Baeks didn't want asked. He watched, specifically, the year-old Baek patriarch Euro Ji-hoon's grandfather, Euro quietly restructured the family's port holdings through a private debt instrument to avoid a tax exposure that would have cost him control of 2 peers. My father bought that debt instrument, not directly Euro, never directly. That wasn't his way Euro, but through 3 shell entities with names so boring nobody ever thought to look twice at them. Ashford Maritime Holdings, Corvid Bay Trust, Nettleton Family Partners. By the time I was 22 years old, sitting across from my father at his kitchen table while he was dying of the cancer that would take him within the year, he slid a leather folder across to me and said the sentence that changed the rest of my life. "Selah, baby, I need you to understand something before I go. You are going to inherit the paper on the Baek shipping empire, not the company. The debt underneath it, every ship they float, every pier they lease, every port fee they collect, Euro, it all runs on a note that comes due in full, at my discretion or the discretion of whoever holds it after me. I've held it quiet for 15 years because a debt you never call in is worth more than one you do. But baby, I won't be here to hold it anymore. That's going to be your job now. I remember sitting there at that kitchen table watching him fade a little more every week, thinking back to when I was maybe 9 years old, sitting on the floor of his study while he sorted through a stack of ledgers by lamplight, long after my mother had gone to bed. I'd asked him once why he kept so many little notebooks instead of just one big one, the way I organized my school folders. Because the people who lose everything, baby girl, are the ones who keep it all in one place where somebody can find it and take it all at once, he'd told me, not looking up from the page. You spread your knowing out. You keep a little bit here, a little bit there, and you never let anybody see the whole shape of what you understand until the day you need them to see it. That's not deception, Selah. That's patience with teeth. I hadn't understood it then, not really. I'd thought it was just something old judges said to make bedtime conversation sound more important than it was. It wasn't until I was sitting across from him at 22, watching him slide that leather folder toward me with hands that had gotten too thin, too fast, that I understood he'd been training me for this exact moment since before I could tie my own shoes. Why me? I'd asked him that day. Why not a lawyer, a trustee, somebody who does this for a living? He'd smiled at me then, the tired smile of a man who'd spent 30 years watching other people's carefully built lives come apart in his courtroom, always for the same reason a euro somebody underestimated who was actually watching. Because a trustee will only ever hold the paper, Selah. You're going to know how to hold the patience. There's a difference, and it's the difference that's going to matter when the day comes that you need both at once. I didn't understand, at 22, what that meant. I understood it a lot better at 25, when I met Ji-hoon Baek at his own father's hospital bedside, holding a hand that was, without either of us knowing it yet, holding onto a debt my family already owned. People will ask, later, whether I married him because of the debt. I need to be clear about this, because it matters. I married him because for the first 11 months I knew him, before grief hollowed him out and ambition filled the hollow back in with something colder. He was the gentlest man I had ever let close to me. The debt was never why I said yes, but it became, very precisely, why I was able to survive what came after. By the time Yoona Cho's robe appeared in my closet, I had been quietly doing my own version of what my father did for 30 years. Watching. Documenting. Understanding exactly how deep the water was before anyone else in the house realized there was water at all. I knew, for instance, that Ji-hoon had taken out a personal loan against 2 of the company's smaller vessels 6 months earlier. A loan he hadn't disclosed to his own board, routed through a private lender to cover a shortfall Yoona Cho's consulting fees had opened up in the shipping division's books. I knew that Sang-woo, his oldest lieutenant, and the only man in the organization who'd been loyal to his father instead of to him, had started making quiet calls to 2 of the other Baek family shipping partners, sounding out whether they'd support a change in leadership if it came to that. I knew, because Madame Baek liked to drink good wine and speak carelessly in front of the woman she still, after 3 years, considered furniture rather than family, that she had begun transferring small amounts of her personal jewelry to a safety deposit box under her maiden name, the universal gesture of a woman preparing an exit she hadn't yet told anyone she was planning. Everyone in that house was quietly preparing for a war. Nobody had noticed that the person holding the only weapon that actually mattered was the wife they'd all stopped paying attention to. There was one afternoon, about 10 days after the robe, when I found myself alone with Yoona Cho in the sunroom, the 2 of us waiting for Madame Baek to finish a phone call so we could all go over the gala seating chart together like one big, dysfunctional family. Yoona was scrolling through her phone, legs crossed, perfectly at ease in a house that wasn't hers, and she said, without looking up, "You know, Selah, I think it's admirable how calm you are about all this. Some wives would have made a scene by now. Would that have made you leave?" I asked her, keeping my voice as light as hers. She looked up then, and for just a second, something flickered behind her eyes that wasn't quite confidence. "Ji-hoon says you're very understanding. Very practical. He says that's one of the things he respects about you." "Ji-hoon says a lot of things," I said, and I smiled at her the way I'd learned to smile at people who thought pleasantness was the same thing as surrender. "I hope you're finding the East Wing comfortable. It gets good light in the mornings." She studied me for a moment, clearly trying to decide whether I was being generous or something else entirely, and I let her wonder, because uncertainty is a more useful weapon against a woman like Yoona Cho than anger would ever be. anger she could report back to Ji-hoon as proof his wife was unstable, unreasonable, the jealous type he'd need managing. Calm she had no framework for. Calm unsettled her in a way I watched settle into her shoulders for the rest of that afternoon. A few nights later, coming down the back staircase for a glass of water, I heard Sang-woo's voice, low and careful, coming from the study Ji-hoon rarely used anymore. I stopped on the landing, out of sight, and listened. 2 of the shipping partners are ready to talk succession if it comes to that. Sang-woo was saying to someone on the phone, his father built this operation on discipline. This one's building it on a mistress and a shortfall nobody in the boardroom's been told about. That's not leadership, that's a countdown. There was a pause, and then Sang-woo again, quieter. No, not yet. We wait until the shortfall gets big enough that the board has to notice it whether he discloses it or not. Numbers don't lie, even when the man reporting them does. I stood very still on that staircase for a long time after he hung up, my glass of water forgotten in my hand, thinking about my father's old notebooks, spread out across a dozen hiding places instead of gathered into one anybody could steal at once. Sang-woo was playing the same game I was. He just didn't know yet that the numbers he was waiting to use as a weapon against Ji-hoon already belonged, in the most literal sense, to me. There were other dinners in those weeks, smaller humiliations that added up the way water erodes stone a euro, not through any single dramatic strike, but through patient, repeated pressure nobody else in the room seemed to notice was pressure at all. One Sunday, Madame Baek rearranged the place cards so that Yoona Cho sat at Ji-hoon's right hand, the seat that had been mine at every family dinner for 3 years, and moved me 2 seats down, beside a cousin's husband who spent the entire meal talking about golf handicaps. Ji-hoon didn't correct it. He didn't even seem to notice, which somehow stung more than if he'd noticed and let it happen anyway. Another evening, Yoona Cho asked me, in front of 4 dinner guests, whether I'd ever considered that some marriages simply run their natural course, her tone so light and conversational that anyone who wasn't paying close attention would have missed the blade tucked inside it. I answered her the way I answered everyone in that house during those weeks, a euro pleasantly, briefly, and without giving her a single true reaction to carry back to Ji-hoon as proof that his wife was cracking. What none of them understood, and what I never explained, was that every humiliation I absorbed during those weeks went somewhere. Not into bitterness, though there was plenty of that some nights. Alone in the guest room I'd started sleeping in without anyone commenting on it. It went into the same ledger my father had spent 30 years teaching me to keep a euro, a private accounting of exactly who had done what, when, and how it would eventually factor into the accounting that actually mattered. The one sitting quietly in Desmond Okafor's files, waiting for its 90-day clause. I let it build for 3 more weeks. I brought Yoona Cho her coffee in the mornings when she came down late, dressed like she owned the kitchen. I let Madame Baek correct my table settings at dinner in front of guests. I let Ji-hoon come home, smelling like a stranger's perfume, and kiss my cheek like nothing was different, and I kissed him back, calm as still water, because a woman who reacts too early gives away how much she already knows. The night everything changed, Ji-hoon hosted a gala at the House a Euro, the Baek Foundation's annual hospital benefit. 300 of Savannah's wealthiest guests under the ballrooms restored 1890s chandelier, gold light pouring over marble floors his great-grandfather had shipped in from Italy. It was, by design, the kind of event where the Baek family performed its respectability for the city that let it operate. The ballroom smelled the way it always did on gala nights, a euro, beeswax candles, white lilies flown in from somewhere far more expensive than Savannah's own flower markets, and underneath it all, the faint brine of the harbour the family's whole fortune had been built on, drifting in through the tall windows. Ji-hoon insisted on leaving cracked open for what he called authenticity. I remembered, standing there in that ivory dress, the first gala I'd ever attended as his fiancée, 3 years earlier, when he'd held my hand the entire receiving line, like he was afraid someone might try to take me from him. Nobody was holding my hand this year. Yoona Cho wore red. Not subtle red a euro, a red designed to be photographed, to be remembered, to announce something to anyone paying close enough attention. She positioned herself near Ji-hoon for most of the receiving line, close enough that 3 different society photographers caught her hand resting on his arm in shots that would run in the following week's charity page. I wore ivory. I'd chosen it on purpose, The way I chose everything on purpose by then, a Euro cream against his black tie, quiet against her noise, because contrast reads clearer in a room than competition ever does. Madame Baek found me near the champagne fountain an hour into the evening, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Selah, dear, I do hope you're not embarrassed," she said, loud enough for the two women beside her to hear clearly. "Some marriages simply require flexibility. I'm sure a girl of your background understands adjusting to circumstances better than most." The two women beside her laughed the small, ugly laugh of people who know exactly what's being implied and want credit for getting the joke. I watched Yoona Cho, 20 feet away, glance over at exactly that moment, checking to see if I would crack. I didn't crack. I smiled at Madame Baek the way I'd smiled at every person who'd underestimated me my entire life, and I said, "Adjusting to circumstances is a family talent, Madame Baek. I learned it from watching yours." She didn't understand yet what I meant. She would in about 6 weeks. There's a word for the exact moment you stop absorbing humiliation and start collecting it as evidence instead. Comment that word below a euro, the one that describes watching everyone underestimate you while you quietly write down every single thing they're about to regret saying. The turning point came 8 days after the gala, on a Thursday afternoon when Ji-hoon's private banker, a nervous man named Desmond Okafor, who had, unknown to Ji-hoon, been my father's protégé and remained loyal to my family long after my father passed, called me instead of Ji-hoon about the quarterly review of the shipping division's debt instruments. "Mrs. Baek," Desmond said carefully, the way he always spoke when he knew he was about to say something that mattered. "The personal loan Mr. Baek took against the Meridian and the Corvid Wing 6 months ago, a euro, the one routed through Ashford Maritime, a euro. It's coming up for its 90-day review clause next Friday. As the note's ultimate holder of record, you have the right to call it due in full or extend the terms. I need your instruction." I sat very still in my study, the late afternoon sun coming gold through the window the way it does in Savannah in early autumn, and I understood, all at once, that this was the moment my father had spent 15 years quietly building toward without ever meeting the man on the other end of it. "Desmond," I said, "how much of the Baek shipping empire, total, currently sits on paper my family holds?" He was quiet for a moment, and I heard him pull a file. "Ma'am, between the original port note your father acquired and the personal loans Mr. Baek has taken against company assets over the last 2 years, a euro, including 3 he never disclosed to his board. A euro, the answer is all of it. Every pier, every vessel currently in active operation. The house you're sitting in, which was pledged as collateral against the loan that covered Yoona Cho's consulting contract overruns, though I suspect he never told you that part." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting that settle. Not the house a euro, I'd half expected that, if I was honest with myself, given how carelessly Ji-hoon had been spending in every other direction. What settled hardest was the smaller detail, almost an afterthought in Desmond's voice. 3 loans he never disclosed to his board. 3 separate moments where the man I'd married had looked his own directors in the eye. Men whose families had built ships alongside the Baeks for generations and let them believe the company's books were cleaner than they were. "Desmond," I said carefully, "walk me through exactly how deep this goes. I want dates. I want amounts. I want to understand precisely how long he's been building a house of cards before I decide how loudly it needs to come down." He was quiet for a moment, papers shuffling on his end of the line, and when he spoke again, his voice had the careful formality of a man who'd spent his whole career being precise, because precision was the only thing that had ever protected people like us in rooms built by people like the Baeks. "The first undisclosed loan was 14 months ago, ma'am. Small, relatively speaking, a euro enough to cover a shortfall in the Meridian's maintenance budget that would have looked bad in a quarterly report. The second came 8 months ago, larger. And that's the one that first touched Miss Cho's consulting arrangement, though at the time I don't believe Mr. Baek fully understood what he was walking into with her. The third, the one that pledged this house as collateral, was 6 months ago. Your father's original note has been sitting quietly underneath all 3 of them the entire time, accruing exactly as designed. And nobody at the bank flagged this. Nobody was meant to, Mrs. Baek. That's rather the entire architecture your father built. Every one of these loans was routed through private lenders precisely, because private lenders don't ask the kinds of questions that would have flagged anything to a regulator or to a board or, frankly, to a wife. He paused. Your father used to say that a debt structured correctly is invisible right up until the moment somebody decides it shouldn't be anymore. He said the same thing to me at his kitchen table. More or less, I told him, and for just a moment I let myself smile, alone in my study, at the strange, quiet symmetry of it. A euro, a dying man's 15-year patience finally arriving at exactly the moment his daughter needed it most. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because this is where a lot of these stories lie to you. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt, for just a moment, an old and specific grief a euro for the man who'd stood at the back of my father's funeral without an umbrella, for the marriage that might have survived if grief hadn't turned him into someone who needed a mistress in the East Wing to feel powerful. And then, underneath that grief, steady as a heartbeat, I felt something my father would have recognized immediately, because he'd felt it 30 years of courtrooms himself. Clarity. "Desmond," I said, "prepare the full accounting. Every asset, every note, every pledge. I want it ready by Monday. And Desmond, I want a meeting with the Baek Board of Directors. Not Ji-hoon, the board. This Friday, before the 90-day clause lapses." "Understood, Mrs. Baek," he said, and for the first time in 3 years, someone in that family's orbit called me by a name that finally meant exactly what it should have meant the whole time. Before he hung up, Desmond added one more thing. Almost gently. "Ma'am, for whatever it's worth a euro, your father would be proud of how carefully you've held this. 15 years is a long time for anyone to trust a piece of paper to sit quiet and do its work. He trusted it to you because he knew you'd know exactly when it was time to stop being quiet." "Thank you, Desmond," I said, and I meant it more than he probably realized, because in a house full of people who'd spent 3 years mistaking my patience for something small, his was the first voice in weeks that had made me feel like the daughter my father had actually raised, rather than the wife everyone else assumed I'd settled into becoming. The night before the board meeting, I didn't sleep much. I sat in my study with the full accounting Desmond had prepared spread across my desk. Every asset, every pledge, every quiet betrayal laid out in neat columns the way my father had taught me to read a man's whole life in the shape of his debts. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I let myself feel the thing I'd been keeping folded up small for months, a euro, not triumph, not even anger really, just a tired, aching grief for the marriage I'd actually wanted. Back before grief turned Ji-hoon into someone who needed an audience to feel like a man. I thought about calling Tamsin, but I already knew what she'd say, and I already knew she'd be right. And some nights you don't need to hear the right thing said out loud, a euro, you just need to sit with it until it settles into your bones on its own. I thought about my father, about the leather folder, about patience with teeth. I thought about Madame Baek's voice at the engagement dinner. A euro. I do hope you're prepared to carry your share a euro. And I realized, sitting there at 2 in the morning with the whole architecture of that family's fortune laid out in front of me in my own handwriting, that I had been carrying their share for 3 years without a single one of them noticing the weight. Tomorrow, I decided, I would finally set it down where they could all see exactly how heavy it had been. I didn't tell Ji-hoon what was coming. I want to be clear that this wasn't cruelty a euro, or if it was the same cruelty he'd shown me every night he came home, smelling like Unicho's perfume, and let me believe I hadn't noticed. I simply did what he had been doing to me for months. I let him keep living inside a version of events that wasn't true anymore, because the version that was true would arrive on its own schedule, whether or not he was ready for it. Friday morning, I walked into the Baek Maritime boardroom on the 9th floor of the harbour office, wearing a grey suit instead of ivory, because some rooms call for armour instead of contrast. 7 board members sat around the mahogany table a euro, including Sang-woo, who'd spent the last 3 weeks quietly courting 2 of them toward a coup he thought nobody knew about, and Ji-hoon himself, who looked up when I walked in with an expression that told me he genuinely did not understand why his wife was standing in his boardroom instead of at home arranging flowers. "Selah," he said, half rising. "What is this?" "Sit down, Ji-hoon," I said, and something in my voice made him do it without arguing, which told me he already sensed, on some animal level, that the ground under him had shifted before his mind had caught up to why. Desmond distributed the folders. I watched 7 faces read, in real time, the exact shape of the trap my father had built 15 years earlier, and I had quietly maintained for the last 3. Every pier, every vessel, the house on Whitfield Square. The personal loan against the Meridian and the Corvid Wing, routed through Ashford Maritime, which every person at that table now understood was not some anonymous lender, but the woman sitting at the head of the table in a grey suit. "This is a mistake," Ji-hoon said, but his voice had already lost the certainty it needed to sell that sentence. "It's not a mistake," I said. "It's the note your grandfather signed to save 2 peers from a tax exposure 30 years ago. It's the loan you took against company assets to cover Unicho's overruns without disclosing it to this board. It's every quiet transfer your mother has been making to a safety deposit box under her maiden name, because some part of her already knew this family's foundation was built on sand nobody bothered to check." Madame Baek, who I hadn't even realized was present until that moment, went very pale near the window. "I'm not here to destroy this company," I continued, and I meant it, because destruction was never the point a Euro precision was. "I'm here to inform this board that as of this morning, I am formally calling the 90-day review clause on the notes currently held by Ashford Maritime, Corvid Bay Trust, and Nettleton Family Partners. Full accounting, full repayment schedule, full transparency to every person in this room going forward. And I am requesting, as is my right as the controlling note holder, a restructuring of executive oversight on this company's shipping division, effective immediately." One of the older board members, a silver-haired man named Harlan Voss, who had served on that board since Ji-hoon's grandfather's time, let out a low whistle and set the folder down like it had gotten too heavy to hold. 15 years, he said, mostly to himself. 15 years and not one of us caught it. "You weren't meant to," I said. That's the entire design of a note like this. It only reveals itself when the person holding it decides the time has come, not when the people who owe it start feeling nervous. Another board member, a woman near the end of the table who'd said almost nothing all morning, finally spoke. "Mrs. Baek, if I may a euro, what exactly do you intend to do with this position? Because there's a version of this morning where you walk out of here owning a shipping empire outright, and there's a version where you walk out having simply told us the truth. Those are very different mornings." "They are," I agreed. "And I've already decided which one this is. I'm not here to take the company that built this city's harbour for 3 generations. I'm here to make sure it never again operates on debt this size without every person in this room knowing exactly what they're standing on. That's not vengeance. That's the oversight a company like this should have had the day your board first let a personal loan get routed through a private lender without disclosure." Sang-woo, who had spent 3 weeks planning a coup that suddenly looked laughably small next to the one that had actually been building in the room the entire time, sat back slowly and, for the first time since I'd known him, looked at me with something that wasn't dismissal. "You'd be within your legal rights to seize the whole operation," he said quietly. "I know," I said. "I'm not going to. I'm going to do something worse for the people in this room who assumed I was furniture. I'm going to keep it running, transparently, under terms I dictate, with oversight this company should have had 30 years ago instead of quiet debt nobody disclosed. Every person who benefited from pretending I didn't understand what I was looking at is about to learn exactly how much I understood the entire time. That word, euro, understood euro, is the one I'd choose if you asked me to name the whole arc of my marriage in a single syllable. Everyone in that family mistook my quiet for not understanding. My quiet was the understanding. It just hadn't needed to speak yet. The fallout took 6 weeks to fully settle, and I won't pretend it was clean, because betrayal this size never resolves itself neatly, no matter how satisfying the ending looks from the outside. 3 days after the board meeting, I came home earlier than anyone in that house expected me to. I found the door to what had once been our bedroom standing open, and inside it, Ji-hoon sitting on the edge of the bed, still in his shirt sleeves, Unicho beside him in her robe, 2 suitcases already packed and standing upright at the foot of the mattress. On the wall behind them hung the framed photograph from the gala, 3 years earlier, a Euro, Ji-hoon and Yuna, caught mid-laugh by one of those society photographers the week before everything unraveled, a Euro, its glass cracked corner to corner, though neither of them ever told me how, and I never asked. I stood in the doorway in the cream suit I'd worn to the closing on the house that morning. The black leather folder Desmond had prepared held against my side a euro deed, embossed in gold across the cover, ownership beneath it, a euro, and in my other hand, the new set of keys the title company had cut that afternoon, the old ones already reissued in my name alone. I didn't raise my voice. I've found, over the years, that you rarely need to. I see you're already packing, I said. That saves us both a difficult conversation. Ji-hoon looked up first, and whatever he saw on my face made him go very still. Yoon stood, smoothing her robe, some old instinct for damage control kicking in a beat too late to matter. You could have destroyed all of us, she said. Why didn't you? Because destroying you was never the point, Yoon, I told her, and I meant it. You were never the disease. You were a symptom of a man who needed an audience to feel powerful after his father died. I hope wherever you land next, you find something that doesn't require you to hang your things in another woman's closet to feel like you matter. She didn't have an answer for that. She picked up her suitcases within the hour. Once it became clear that the consulting contract funding her lifestyle had been quietly terminated, along with every other unauthorized expense, the new financial oversight structure caught in its first audit. I heard, second-hand, that she resurfaced in Charleston, attached to a different wealthy man within 2 months a euro. Some things about a person don't change just because their situation does. Madame Baek did not leave, though her jewellery did, quietly, to a small apartment she kept under her maiden name for exactly the reason I'd suspected a euro she'd known, on some level, that this house of cards was always going to fall, and she'd been preparing her own exit long before mine arrived. She came to me a week after the board meeting, without the sharpness she'd carried at the engagement dinner 3 years earlier, and said the closest thing to an apology I ever heard leave her mouth. I underestimated you the way I was raised to underestimate women who look like you, Selah. I won't pretend that's an easy thing for a woman my age to admit, but I am admitting it. I know, I said. That's enough for me. When the board restructuring was finalized, she requested, with more humility than I'd ever heard from her in 3 years, a small role advising the Foundation's charitable division. I granted it. Cruelty was never the goal. Precision was. Sang-woo, to his credit, became one of the more effective allies in the new structure. Men who respect strength when they see it clearly are sometimes worth keeping close, once you've stopped needing to worry about which direction their loyalty runs. And Ji-hoon came to my study 3 weeks after the board meeting, on an evening when the light was doing the same gold thing through the window it had been doing the afternoon Desmond first called me. He looked older than he had at the gala. Grief and consequence do that to a face, sometimes in the same month. I didn't know, he said, about the notes, about any of it. I thought I married a judge's daughter with nothing but good posture and a kind face. You did, I said. You also married the only person patient enough to watch this family's foundation for 3 years without saying a word, because I learned a long time ago that the people who talk the loudest about their power are usually the ones with the least of it left to lose. Is there anything left here for us? He asked, and for the first time in months, he sounded like the man who'd stood at the back of my father's funeral without an umbrella, rather than the one who'd let a mistress hang her robe in my closet and thought I wouldn't notice. I didn't answer him that night with certainty, because I've learned the hard way that certainty offered too quickly is usually a lie dressed up as comfort. What I told him was true, and it's the truest thing I know about surviving a betrayal this size without losing yourself in the process of surviving it. I don't know yet, Ji-hoon, but I know the empire runs in my name now, transparently, with oversight it should have had decades ago. I know the house is mine, on paper and otherwise. And I know that whatever comes next between us, it's going to happen on terms where nobody in this family mistakes my patience for weakness ever again. He nodded slowly, like a man accepting a verdict he already knew was coming. And for a moment I saw the ghost of the boy who'd stood in the rain at my father's funeral without an umbrella, the one who'd once told me flowers die, and he didn't want to give me one more thing to watch wilt. Your father would have liked watching this happen, he said quietly. I think some part of him built this exact moment 15 years before either of us knew it was coming. He didn't build it for revenge, I said. He built it because he spent 30 years on a bench watching men like your grandfather assume nobody was keeping score. He wanted to make sure that whatever happened to this family, it happened on paper, somebody honest was holding. And now that's you. Now that's me. Over the following weeks, Ji-hoon tried, in small and sometimes clumsy ways, to prove that the man from the funeral hadn't been entirely buried under 3 years of grief and ambition. He started coming home at hours that matched what he actually told me, rather than hours that matched a lie he thought I hadn't noticed. He sat through 2 full board sessions under the new oversight structure without once trying to talk over Desmond's reports, which for a man raised to believe his voice was the only one that mattered in a room, was its own kind of small miracle. He asked me, once, haltingly, whether I'd consider seeing a counsellor with him, not to save what we'd been, necessarily, but to understand honestly what was left standing once the smoke cleared. I said yes to the counsellor. I haven't said yes to anything beyond that yet, and I've stopped pretending, even to myself, that I know exactly which way this particular story ends. Some episodes of a life don't come with a bow. They come with an honest accounting, and you decide, day by day, what you're willing to keep building on top of it. 6 months later, the Baek Maritime Group posted its most transparent quarterly report in company history, and the Savannah Business Press ran a small feature on the quiet restructuring that had apparently stabilized a company rumored to be sitting on undisclosed debt. Nobody outside that boardroom ever learned the full story of how it happened, and I've never corrected them. Some victories are better held close, the same way my father held his patience close for 15 years before he ever needed to spend it. Ji-hoon and I are still working out what we are to each other, some days better than others. I won't pretend this ends the way the fairy tales do, with every wrong instantly forgiven the moment the truth comes out. Grief doesn't work that way. And neither does trust, once it's been spent carelessly by someone who thought it would always just be there when they wanted it back. But I sleep every night now in a house that is unmistakably, undeniably mine. My name is on the deed. My name is on the notes. My name is on the empire that 3 different people spent 3 years assuming belonged to everyone in that family except the quiet woman who kept their coffee warm and their humiliations counted. I learned patience from a man who spent 30 years on a bench watching other people's foundations crack before they ever noticed the sound. I learned precision from watching a mistress hang her robe in my closet and deciding that the correct response wasn't rage or euro, it was research. And I learned, finally, the thing I think every woman who's ever been underestimated eventually learns, if she's patient enough to wait for the proof. The quietest person in the room is very often the one holding the only ledger that actually matters. They just never think to ask to see it until it's already too late. Some nights, I still walk out to the harbour at dusk, past the piers my great-grandfather-in-law once mortgaged in secret, and my own father quietly bought the paper on 30 years before I was old enough to understand what a promissory note even was. I watched the Meridian and the Corvid Wing come in with the tide, their hulls catching the last orange light the way they must have caught it for 3 generations of Baeks who never once imagined a woman like me would end up holding the note underneath their whole inheritance. I think about my father, sitting at that kitchen table with a folder too heavy for how thin his hands had gotten, telling me that patience with teeth was the only kind of patience worth having. I think about Madame Baek's voice at the engagement dinner, warning me to be prepared to carry my share. I think about a silk robe hanging in my closet on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and how close I came, in that first unguarded second, to letting it break something in me that would have taken years to rebuild. It didn't break me. It built me. The same slow, patient way my father built his quiet fortune out of 30 years of watching other people's carelessness, Euro 1 ledger, 1 note, 1 unhurried Tuesday at a time. I am not the woman Madame Baek assumed she was getting when her son brought me home to that garden 3 years ago. I never was. She just never thought to ask which version of me she was actually looking at until the day the answer was already sitting, undeniable, in her own family's boardroom. I hope, if you've stayed with me this long, that you carry one thing away from this house on Whitfield Square with its restored chandeliers and its buried debts. Whatever room you're standing in right now, wherever someone has decided you're furniture instead of family, keep your own quiet ledger. Keep it patient. Keep it precise. And when the day finally comes to open it the way my father taught me a euro, not out of anger, but out of an accounting so honest nobody in the room can argue with a single line of it. That's not revenge. That's just, finally, the truth arriving exactly on schedule.